Okay. All right. We're recording. So let me once again welcome everyone to this meeting of the Public Power Observatory with Scott Aquanno and Steve Maher to discuss how to finance energy transition. My name is Ashley Dawson. I'm professor at the City University of New York and also a member of the Public Power New York campaign and one of the co-founders of the Public Power Observatory. The goal of the Public Power Observatory, as I conceive of it, is to help disseminate information to the public about the struggle for energy transition in and beyond New York. So just a bit of background for those of you who are not familiar with the Public Power Campaign or haven't heard about what has been happening recently, and there's been a lot going on just in the last few days, not to mention the last weeks and months. The Public Power Campaign was founded roughly 6 years ago here in New York State. The goal was to fight for a public and just energy transition. We won a really important victory when we passed the Build Public Renewables Act about a year and a half ago, 2023, in the spring of 2023. The Build Public Renewables Act mandates a public authority-led energy transition. In other words, it mandates that the New York Power Authority, which has been around since the New Deal era in the 1930s, be responsible for getting the state to what the Climate Act of 2019 requires. That is, that it have 70% clean power in the grid by 2030. So this was a really big victory, something that resonated all around the US and internationally as one of the most important victories of the Green New Deal, of the movement for a Green New Deal. But we are woefully behind in reaching the goals that BPRA and the Climate Act mandates. NYPA, as of this fall, has committed to just 3.5 gigawatts of new renewables. And our analysis at the Public Power New York campaign is that we need 15 gigawatts of new renewables. So we're definitely not on track. And just a day or two ago, Governor Hochul announced new contracts for only half of a gigawatt, 0.5 gigawatts. So we're barely at 5% of the minimum what we need to get to. And that's despite all of our efforts since we passed BPRA in 2023 to push the governor and to push NYPA to do the right thing. So we seem to be facing some pretty significant political roadblocks. Or maybe they're actually economic hurdles, or maybe they're both here in New York. And of course, at the same time, Trump is about to pull the plug on significant federal funding for energy transition. So it seems like a really important moment to take stock of where we are, how we got here, and to think about how to move forward, particularly with the federal government essentially bailing on the project of energy transition. And it seems like a particularly opportune moment to draw on the expertise of Dr. Scott Aquanno and Steve Maher. So I'm so happy to have the two of them with me today. Thank you both for agreeing to speak with me and with other public power activists today. Let me just do a very quick introduction to the two of you. So you are the co-authors of The Fall and Rise of American Finance, which was published last year by Verso Books. This is a super valuable book. I really encourage everyone to read it if you haven't already done so. It traces the cycles of collapse and reconstitution of US financial power over the long 20th century, from the disintegration of robber baron J.P. Morgan's vast empire, which incidentally included really significant holdings in energy production and transmission and distribution, all the way up to today's financial behemoth, BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset management company. So we could really find nobody better to talk to us about questions of finance and transition than Scott and Steve. Scott is an associate professor of political science at Ontario Tech University, and he's published widely on monetary policy development and the political economy of finance and globalization. And Steve is assistant professor of economics at SUNY Cortland. He's the co-editor of the Socialist Register, and he's also, in addition to co-authoring The Fall and Rise of American Finance, Steve is the author of Corporate Capitalism and the Integral State, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2022. So welcome again to everyone, and especially to Scott and Steve. Thank you again for joining us. So
thanks very much.
Great to have you.
Our pleasure.
All right, so let's start out by talking a little bit about where we are and how we got here. So I wanted to ask you about the dominant model of financing energy transition today in the US. And I'm thinking specifically of tax equity finance. I wanted to see what your analysis of this model is. You know, how common is it in relation to other elements of US capital, and how specific is it to the US? How do other countries finance public sector work, something like energy transition?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ashley, for that introduction. And it's really great to be here. Really great to meet you. Really great to talk with all you folks. So basically, to answer your question about tax equity finance, this relies on what in economics is often called tax expenditure. So it basically means, transferring public money into private hands through the mechanism of tax rebates. So individuals or firms are given tax rebates for investing in specific assets that the state wants them to invest in, right? And so that means if you have large tax liabilities, if you owe a lot of taxes, you can get breaks on those taxes by investing in the kinds of assets that the state wants you to invest in. So the idea is that this is a way for the state to direct private capital into the kinds of investments that it thinks are socially necessary, but otherwise not being undertaken based on private market incentives alone. So because the state is giving up tax revenues to these firms and individuals in exchange for their willingness to invest in these particular asset classes, the state is forfeiting tax revenues, right? So this is a form of spending. It's a form of spending by the government that in the form of forfeited tax revenues that has the effect of effectively transferring finances, transferring money from public hands into private hands in exchange for their willingness to undertake those specific investments. And so what that means is that this only really applies to individuals and firms that have large tax liabilities. If you don't owe taxes, in other words, you're not going to benefit from tax breaks. So it really does tend to rely specifically on incentivizing private sector investors, contrary to the program of your campaign, for example, to invest in these technologies and assets. Now, I guess we may get to this in a minute, but the Inflation Reduction Act did change that a little bit because it had this provision called direct pay, which allowed public institutions without large tax liabilities to also benefit from direct payments from the federal government to support those investments. So it was intended to incentivize public as well as private institutions to undertake these investments. There's all kinds of other problems with that. But just to describe where we're at now, that is the conventional model in the neoliberal period, at least, that is used to support energy investment, but also in general, large-scale infrastructure investment, including things like Amazon warehouses. When Amazon wants to open a warehouse in a jurisdiction, one of the ways that they're incentivized to do that, for example, is by the municipal or state government basically saying, we're going to subsidize all the costs of the fixed capital, the cost of the warehouse and the plant and all the machinery, by giving you tax breaks that are of equal value. And so what actually ends up happening is very often the state ends up taking on basically all of the upfront investment costs, and the private institutions end up privatizing all the profits. So it's a classic example of the public taking on all the costs and all the risk, but the private capitalists getting all the benefits when profits are to be made, and the public not being able to do so. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. There's a lot more to say on it, of course, but.
Yeah, and just to add to what Steve was saying, this is the model that's been used not only in the United States, of course, And the IRA, even though it modifies it through direct pay, is still reliant on this. But it's a model that's been used widely, including across Europe. Germany in the last year or so announced quite substantive tax credits in the amount in the range of about $10 billion annually to fund green infrastructure and the green transition. So this is a very common model, especially in the neoliberal period.
And just to add one last point, the de-risking model that we're basically explaining here, a model whereby the private investors are being incentivized to do what the government or the public wants based on the government taking on the risk and the cost. It really is unbalanced in terms of the way that it.
Yeah, this is Leonard Rotberg. I left a message, and I think you or someone called me back. I'm trying to access. I'm retired, and I'm trying to as a faculty member, and I'm trying to access the research resources at the library, and somehow the whole internet connection is not working.
Hi, Lynn. Sorry, I
URL.
should mute you because I think you're having a conversation with somebody else.
Yeah.
Hey, everybody.
Anyway, so so it's a model called de-risking, where basically the government's taking on the risk and the cost, and the private sector is getting the benefits. What this basically amounts to, just to put it in very pithy terms, is bribing capital. Right? The government is trying to bribe. The model is based on bribing capital to do what it wants without challenging the basic logic of for-profit investment and private gain as the motivation for investing in anything. And so what that basically means then is that it's up to capital whether or not it wants to do that. So it may decide that the incentives aren't good enough. So all of the balance of power, the whole conditions of the arrangement are established by the private firms. If it's not enough for them to undertake the actions and the investments that the government wants, they don't do it. And if they don't do it, there's no way of forcing them to do it. Or if they promise to do certain things that they then don't do, there's not really any way of punishing them. So this basically results in a situation in which private businesses, private corporations hold all the power. And the state is completely beholden to their willingness to participate on a voluntary basis in doing what the state and the public have determined is socially necessary. So there's other problems too, but I think that's really the crux of it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you to you both for outlining that. I mean, it sounds like a great deal for private capital and a horrible deal for taxpayers and the citizenry. So I guess I have a question about where this model came from, and what were the political conditions. I mean, obviously capital is always fighting to get control of the state and to get the state to grease the wheels of capital accumulation. But both of you referred kind of briefly to neoliberalism and to how this model is quite specific to a particular era in capitalist history. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about where the model comes from, what the political conditions were under which it grew, and what vicissitudes it's facing, particularly in relation to the kind of cycles of capital that you discussed in the wonderful book I referred to before, The Rise and Fall of Capital in America.
Scott, do you want to say something, or do you?
No, go ahead, Steve. I'll jump in a second.
Yeah, I mean, so in a broad sense, this model of tax expenditure, it emerged as the state faced, especially municipal and state governments, faced new fiscal constraints. That is to say, constraints on their ability to tax and spend with the onset of the neoliberal period, both because of the way that the global finance relates to the state, and also because of the changing balance of class forces, whereby capital profoundly defeated the trade union movement and labor as a condition for paving the way for a new round of globalization coming out of the 1970s crisis, the inflation crisis of the 1970s. And as well as just the basic governance structure of the American state in general, where the federal nature of the American state has generally or very often required that individual states are not able to run deficits. And so in the absence of fiscal capacities, state and municipal governments increasingly turn to using tax incentives as the main way that they can spend money. because of course it doesn't require them to raise taxes on any rich people. It doesn't require them to challenge capitalists. In fact, it's just giving money to capitalists for them doing what you want to do. So it doesn't require the normal fiscal machinery, but it is still a form of spending. The IRA in particular obviously emerges from a moment in which I think there's two basically critical dynamics for understanding the form that the IRA took. The first is the internal, we might call legitimation crisis of the American state. The establishment, the political and economic institutions that are predominantly responsible for governing our society are widely discredited and seen as illegitimate by huge swaths of the population. That's related to the underlying social crisis that we're experiencing, working class people's lives becoming more precarious, right? The healthcare crisis, communities crumbling and falling apart under now 4 decades of neoliberal restructuring working class communities, as well as the climate crisis, which a very large proportion of the population is very aware that the state is not doing anything on the scale necessary to resolve what is an existential crisis for human beings. And so in the context of that legitimacy crisis, the state decided to, one of the responses from the Biden administration was to attempt to partly address that legitimacy crisis by spending on things that the public sees as necessary or good. And the way that happened, in the absence of actual working class power pushing for this, because of course the working class is defeated and weak, the left is still, despite some promising signs, quite weak in this country. So the IRA didn't emerge from pressure from below as the original New Deal did. It emerged from the state attempting to navigate this festering legitimacy crisis inside the American social formation among the population. And so the form that took was one that prioritized incentives to corporations and handouts to corporations rather than actually improving the lives of working people on the scale that's necessary. And the second part of the conjuncture is the competition with China. So the IRA is always couched in very militaristic and nationalistic terms as part of a global competition with China to control and develop the technologies of the future. And so the right-wing militarist kind of component of the IRA and the corporate handout element of the IRA are both a function of the IRA being implemented in the context of the weakness of the left and of the working class.
Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, tax credits and tax incentives have a long history in the United States, well beyond that of the neoliberal period. But in the absence of the capacity to direct capital to specific projects, in the absence of the type of facilities we saw in the 1930s, for example, like the RFC and other institutions that were really never developed in the United States, at least substantively, the challenge of allocating credit to particular projects, especially in the context of this ideology of market dependency and the attempt to grow markets as a way of solving social problems and social issues, comes to take this form. It comes to take the form of subsidizing business investment and de-risking business investment, as opposed to the state taking direct action itself to allocate investment into particular fields and particular areas. So this is one option, one of two main options that's developed in the context of a kind of a market revolution that we're all very familiar with, but also in the face of the lack of capacity of the state to act otherwise, right? And the unwillingness to do so.
The RFC, just to say, the RFC that Scott mentioned is the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was the capital bank that supported the New Deal programs, much of the New Deal implemented by Roosevelt. And so we could talk more about that. I think there's elements of that could be an interesting model to think about going forward.
Great, thank you both. Yeah, this political conjuncture that you've traced is so interesting and so important. Just a kind of quick question, since I know these issues are not specific to the U.S. Scott, you mentioned Germany and the European Union. I wanted to also think about a kind of global terrain. How are these models being exported to developing countries, and what are the implications of this sort of tax equity model for the global South? Nations that are just trying to develop their infrastructure, and in particular, places where there's serious energy poverty. Is that something that you all can comment on, I wonder?
We certainly haven't. Most of our work hasn't focused on this area. So I for one don't feel I have a lot of research here to back up to back up a strong position or to inform an adequate response. I mean, I think what's important, and Steve, jump in here afterwards, please, is to understand the way in which tax credits and tax equity undermines the fiscal capacity of states to act and to act directly, right? Subsidies directly to corporations to make markets and to make ventures that were not profitable, and to facilitate conversion, which is not profitable, for capital profitable, right? Erodes simultaneously the fiscal capacity of the state and the ability of the state to act both now and the future, insofar as the tax cuts and subsidies are carried into the future. And these have long been a part of developmental strategies imposed by the IMF and other institutions in the Washington Consensus, as we know. I can't speak offhand to specific initiatives and projects, Steve. I'm not sure if you feel comfortable doing so, other than to say more generally that this has been a key component of kind of the macroeconomic monetary regime that's been exported from the US through the Washington Consensus, again, throughout the neoliberal period and continuing to today.
Yeah, I mean, there is this question of what's left of the developmental state, right? The conception of economic development that was oriented around the formation of a strong state that could undertake what we call capital formation, right? Rather than just passively responding on the world market to comparative advantage. That is to say, producing the stuff or exporting the stuff that markets at the current moment say are efficient at producing or exporting. So for the developing world, that has traditionally been primary commodities, right? Things like raw materials, right? The developmental state idea was that the state would take an active role in creating comparative advantages by itself allocating savings to construct comparative advantages around industries that were higher value added industries and involved a greater level of technological development. So historically speaking, the so-called Washington Consensus would have prevented that, right? The goal of the objective of the Washington Consensus was liberalization. And the effect of that was if you didn't have a natural endowment of particular natural resources, then you were SOL. And if you did, then you'd be locked into exporting those primary commodities. But what the developmental state theorists ultimately pointed out was that these comparative advantages that like the advanced capitalist countries have, for example, producing Microsoft computers or Microsoft operating systems, those weren't endowed by nature. Those are formed through historical and institutional conditions. And so those industries have to be cultivated and developed. And one way of doing that is through a developmental state, an active state that played a direct role in directing investment to those sectors and industries that markets at the current moment wouldn't see as competitive, but which could be made competitive over the longer term with the proper support and protections. So there's the use of the state's role in directly allocating investment, and there's a use of tariffs and other protectionist measures to protect those industries and allow them to become stronger, and then ultimately subject them to the competitive disciplines of the world market. Now, this also has serious problems, and I think you see the way that the U.S. right now under the CHIPS Act, for example, is attempting to protect American semiconductor manufacturers from Chinese competition. That may have the effect of strengthening, increasing semiconductor production in the U.S., but it's also going to come at the expense of the fact of the possibility to develop a regime based on international cooperation in addressing this existential crisis represented by climate change, right? So rather than the American corporations being incentivized and subsidized to develop green technologies, right, just so that the Chinese don't get them first, while barring imports of Chinese technologies that are already existing, right, so that we can compete, so our corporations make the profits instead of Chinese corporations or whatnot. What we should be thinking about is how to overcome these disciplines of capitalist competitiveness in order to develop a regime of global cooperation that serves all of humanity in the interest of combating the climate crisis, which actually threatens us all equally. And so the tariffs that have been put on Chinese high technology exports under the guise, of course, of national security have actually had the effect of inhibiting a green transition. In order to ensure that the intellectual property resources that are going to be the valuable technologies of the future remain in the hands of American corporations in the interest of this competition with China. So as important as the IRA is in many ways, and the CHIPS Act, for supporting a green transition, and it's extremely limited, and we could talk about that. It's barely a drop in the bucket compared to what's needed. It also has profoundly obstructed the capacity for a regime of international cooperation to emerge that would actually be necessary for us all to address climate change.
Thank you both for that. It makes a great deal of sense, and I really appreciate your emphasis on the ways in which kind of inter-imperial economic competition inhibits the kind of green transition that we really need on a global scale. And this kind of leads into my next question, which has to do with ideas about the increasingly low cost of renewable energy as a factor that would kind of inherently, as a result of this market dynamic, lead to shutting down the fossil fuels, right? As solar panels have become cheaper, the argument has been, well, we should see renewable energy investment taking off and investment in fossil fuels collapsing. But in fact, that's not at all what happened. And of course, if we think about why solar has gotten so much cheaper, it's not because of IRA or similar kinds of tax equity structures. It's largely because of the kind of developmentalist states' investment, particularly in China, in building out green technologies, right? So I think that really is an important note to kind of underline in relation to what you were just saying, Steve, about the way the green transition has been and will probably be increasingly inhibited by tariff structures of various different kinds. But I wanted to get your take on Britt Christopher's recent book, The Price is Wrong, where he makes an argument about how this sort of sense that market dynamics have made renewable energy cheaper and that's going to drive more investment, and basically says, there's a problem with that analysis. So maybe could you lay out some of his analysis and give us a sense of, whether you think he's on the mark in his critique?
Yeah, I mean, there's really what Christopher's is doing, which is extremely important, I think, is that he's busting this traditional neoclassical economics or mainstream economics myth that basically markets are really efficient. And markets like low costs, markets like low prices, markets like competitive price-driven efficiency. And so therefore, as it would stand to reason from that perspective, as the prices of renewable energy falls, they should be widely adopted. And so from that perspective, the magic of the market will save us all from climate change. As these new technologies, the price of these new technologies fall, they will gradually be rolled out because it's in the interest of capital to adopt these technologies, which, while they happen to be sustainable, are also cheaper. So we can kind of just sit back and relax as the magic of markets gradually rolls out these new technologies, automatically transitions our energy system from one source of fuel to another, and we're all climate change is fixed. This is a myth, as Christopher points out, primarily because what capitalism is primarily concerned about, it's a very basic point, and it comes from the work of Anwar Sheikh, among other Marxian economists. What capitalism is primarily interested in is not low prices, nor efficiency, actually. What it's interested in is profits. And so, yes, it's true that the prices of renewable energy systems have fallen, but at the same time, partly because those prices have fallen, they're not profitable. They're not sufficiently profitable to warrant a reallocation of capital away from the existing fossil fuel infrastructures toward alternative renewable energy infrastructures. For that to happen, these renewable energy systems would have to become, the margins on those would have to go up. And so, just in many ways, corporations want higher prices, right? They don't want to sell. I mean, of course, competition compels them to sell their commodities as cheaply as they can, but they would theoretically be able to make wider margins if prices were higher. So the collapse in the price of renewable energy systems that happens whenever they remove subsidies is precisely what has led to the persistence of fossil fuels as the profit margins on those commodities are substantially higher than renewables. And so what Christopher's is basically showing is that there is no way in which there's a market incentive, pre-existing market incentive, that's going to lead fossil fuels to be phased out. It based on the existing market signals, you're going to continue to have fossil fuel production. unless the state takes some kind of much more active and direct role in supporting the creation of renewable energy infrastructures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so state support, I mean, markets get stuck on fossil fuels precisely because there's not the profit margins within, renewable and green energy to facilitate mass absorption, right? So there's all sorts of reasons for Christopher's, and he lays these out really systematically and I think really, very smartly. There's all types of reasons why lower energy costs, right, do not automatically equate to higher profits. So as prices come down, it's not necessarily the case that profitability is going to go up. For example, in energy, there's all types of other costs associated with like generation, right? And associated with conversion that also have to be factored in, which mean that if wind and solar come down in price per unit, it doesn't necessarily mean it's profitable for firms to invest massively and to build the infrastructure necessary for that type of project. So there's a kind of a mismatch. There's not a necessary relationship between cost, price, and profitability. And because, as Steve was mentioning, it's about profit within capitalism, right? Not about price and not about efficiency, but most importantly about profit. Those blockages will of course have a dramatic impact on the capacity of the market to transition, right? And so, and Christopher's also demonstrates very well that it's because of the fact that green energy and renewable energy is not profitable at the current moment, that investment continues to rely on massive subsidy and becomes, tied up with massive subsidy, drawing prices down, but also ensuring profitability for the sector. Yeah.
So prices falling actually make it harder to profit from that particular technology, right? So prices falling, far from making something more profitable, oftentimes make it less profitable, particularly given the market structure of the renewable sector, which is made up of a large number of small firms. And those firms have effectively no real interest in coordinating with one another. They have no real, because they're competing, they have no real interest in investing extensively in research and development that's going to benefit their rivals, right, through spillover effects. They are only going to undertake the forms of investment that benefit their bottom line at the expense of their competitors. So in a whole host of ways, right, the market-centric approach to any kind of green transition, including renewables infrastructures, is really inadequate. First and foremost, pointing to the need for macro coordination and macro strategy at the macroeconomic level, like across the sector, rather than relying on individual uncoordinated firms undertaking their own profit maximizing strategies. We need macro coordination at least a national scale, but also an international scale, in order to be able to come even close to addressing the climate crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, we've talked in quite a lot of detail about the dysfunction of the current system and its history. So I think you've both opened up the question of viable alternatives. And I wanted to refer to specifically the ideas of my comrades in the Public Power New York campaign, who thought that NIPA would be a good vehicle for us to fight for energy transition behind or around, because of its capacity to issue tax-exempt bonds and because of its strong credit rating. So, it's this big public authority that is essentially able to act like a massive bank, to put it in layman's terms, to borrow a great deal of money and to use that money to build out essential infrastructure. We commissioned a report, the Public Power Campaign commissioned a report that looked into this and estimated that NIPA could borrow close to $10 billion by 2030 to facilitate a kind of expanded energy transition. And this report, was careful to underline that NIPA had to watch its credit rating, and couldn't take on too much debt, but that it had quite a lot of capacity to do that. So I wanted to get both of your take on this analysis. Do you think that public power was right in turning to an authority like NIPA as a possible vehicle? Certainly is not the level of sort of national or even global coordination that you were just alluding to, Stephen, which, obviously is what we all ultimately have to fight for. But in the kind of meantime, is it a vehicle that you think makes sense to keep fighting to push for energy transition, or do you see some big problems in the way that it is structured, and kind of are there connections to what we've been talking about so far in terms of tax equity?
Yeah, I mean, so to me, and without having followed it super closely, the campaign that you guys have been involved in seems like a tremendous victory, and one that was both historic and I think inspirational on a national scale for many people, and that's incredibly important. I think some of the barriers you've run into indicate the need to go further. So, for example, I was just mentioning the need for a kind of macro coordination, and not to rely on market competitiveness as the vehicle for undertaking a green transition, but for macroeconomic coordination and the active and direct involvement of the state in undertaking investment. Now, that also means, in the context of the New York power sector, the not having a public institution that competes with private companies is going to be subject to many of the same problems as market competitiveness in general. But more broadly, I think there's the example of NYPA. There's the example of a number of green banks that have formed at the state level across the country, North Dakota. And I think the barriers that these institutions tend to run into have to do with their ability to access credit. And so what that points to is the need for a nationally coordinated strategy of financing these initiatives at the state level, which requires developing the planning capacities and the financing capacities for the state to take a direct and active role in directing and managing these projects. So basically, the way that the state now works in terms of macroeconomic policy is you have fiscal policy, which is carried out by Congress, right? Congress spends money and the Treasury Department implements those spending priorities. Then you have the Federal Reserve, which does monetary policy. And monetary policy basically involves supporting the banking system, controlling the supply of credit, and trying to manage inflation and unemployment, right? Those are both core pillars of the way that the capitalist economy is managed. But what the state does not currently have the capacity to do is to itself allocate capital, to itself allocate investment. And so I think what has to happen at the federal level is an institution has to be constructed which is able to direct capital to support the kinds of projects at the state level that you guys have been involved in by, for example, purchasing the bonds of those green banks, right? Those bonds, if they were purchased by a federal investment authority that was connected to the Treasury Department and connected to the Federal Reserve, that would immediately have the effect of creating a national market for those green bonds. And if it was connected to the Federal Reserve and to the Treasury Department, that would mean that those investments are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. And so they'd be effectively risk-free. And so what that would open up the possibility to happen would be that, private investors could be basically guaranteed either a rate of return or just at least their principal back at the end of a particular period of a cycle of investment. Now, of course, none of us here are interested in just handing out money to corporations. So I think the way to go about this would be to basically create a regulatory structure where the pension funds are the only public pension funds are the only institutional investors that are allowed to invest in this vehicle. So what you basically do then is you tap into the massive pools of capital that are in the public pension funds, and you direct those funds to support the activities of green banks or NYPA or whatever by purchasing the bonds of those institutions, and thereby guaranteeing those institutional investors a rate of return on basically risk-free assets, and expanding the balance sheet capacity of those green banks and of institutions like NYPA tremendously, right? So there needs to be a national investment authority that basically takes on the role of both setting up the infrastructures necessary for a green transition, which involves a range of projects ranging from housing to clean energy to broadband internet to high-speed rail, right? All of these are elements of a necessary green transition. And so you have a national investment authority that both initiates those projects, raises capital for those projects, and in many cases owns those projects. So it's expanding the public ownership of our green infrastructure, while also gaining greater control over the vast sums of money in the public pension funds, which basically currently are to a huge extent investing in things like private equity companies, right? Which are reinforcing the market pressures, which have squeezed labor, which have privatized infrastructure, which have destroyed working class communities, et cetera. So instead of these pension funds investing in those private equity companies, you could create an opportunity for them to be integrated with a national investment authority so that the public plays the largest role in allocating where those funds go. And at the same time, the public owns and controls the projects that it's investing in, right? And that could include very much ownership of purchasing the bonds of green banks and things like NYPA that would tremendously expand their balance sheet capacity, that would allow them to do things like extensive transition of the energy system, as well as a whole host of other necessary aspects of the complete overhaul of our infrastructure that's going to be necessary to deal with the climate crisis. So there's a woman who used to be at Cornell, who's now at Penn, I believe. She just moved, called Sally Omarova, who has developed a plan to develop such an institution called the National Investment Authority. And basically what this comes down to is the need to fundamentally transform the state, to make it so that the state, rather than simply stepping back and trying to bribe private capitalists to do what it wants and letting them keep the profits, the state plays an active and direct role in allocating investment to things that are deemed socially necessary, and owning and controlling the projects that it's investing in. And ultimately, this opens the door to broader ownership of the assets and capacities that are controlled by private corporations today, right? There is no way of doing a green transition in the context of American capitalism in 2025 other than by mobilizing the capacities that are currently owned and controlled by private corporations. The question is, are we going to mobilize these capacities by trying to bribe those corporations? Or are we going to try to somehow establish greater public control over these capacities, eventually nationalizing these firms and governing them democratically so that these economic infrastructures and capacities can be devoted toward serving social need rather than private profit? And so what I like about the public power campaign is that it's very much militantly committed to the idea that this should be public, and that private ownership is not the way out. But that has to be broader, right? That in order for those public institutions, including green banks, but also things like NYPA, to have the balance sheet capacity to carry out the expenditures necessary to deal with the ecological crisis, we need to massively increase the financial and economic firepower that is available to those institutions. And the best way of doing that is to have a nationally coordinated strategy organized around the kind of institution that I'm describing that could extend large amounts of credit to those institutions and support them with the full faith and credit of the United States. That was a pretty schematic description. It's kind of a complicated proposal, but it's one that I think is both realistic in the sense that it's something that the left could fight for, and that opens the door toward a much more substantial transformation of our economy and our society toward the direction of socialism, which is ultimately going to be necessary in order to really deal with the ecological crisis over the long term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the challenge here is to build on what currently exists in the form of green banks, in the form of NYPA, in the form of those municipalities who have issued municipal bonds to fund green projects. And these are all very exciting and very worthwhile projects. And for NYPA, its capacity to issue large in the bond market, it relates to, of course, its size, its base, and its connection to the state. But we need to scale that up. And the way to scale it up, of course, is to connect all of these different institutions, from state green banks to NYPA to all other, to retail and developmental state banks, et cetera, to link all of that up into the monetary structure of the state. because the monetary system, the credit system in the United States and elsewhere is based on the central bank, and the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve are at the top of this system of credit generating capacity. So the question is, how do we remove market discipline to support public projects to the greatest extent possible? And that requires removing and alleviating market discipline as much as possible from these institutions. And the best way to do that, Steve and I believe, and we kind of took this on to a certain extent in the last chapter of our book, and have been thinking through these issues in greater extent since then, is to really link the NYPA green banks into more systematically the credit generating capacity of the state, and that we believe, and following Omarova and others, is critical for not just expanding credit but preserving the flows of credit that are available here.
Put simply, there is absolutely no way we're going to do the total overhaul of our infrastructure as necessary without state planning. There has to be state planning, and ultimately the financial capacity is necessary to back that planning with action, the fiscal and monetary firepower needed to actually undertake a transition on the scale necessary requires the backing of the full faith and credit of the American state. That requires connecting these initiatives at the state level, such as the one that you guys have participated in, to the federal government. Imagine the balance sheet capacity that would become possible if the bonds issued by NYPA were backed by the full faith and credit of the United States, right? The interest rate on those bonds would fall. You'd have a significant influx of public and private investment into those institutions, and they would ultimately be owned by the public, right? So I think that the key is to think through what does planning realistically look like? How do we get there, and how do we begin the process of transforming the state such that it becomes a vehicle whereby the public can manage the economy and undertake the kinds of investments needed to build the infrastructures to mitigate the effects of climate change and ultimately address the ecological crisis.
Yes.
I mean, so just if I can, one more point, Ashley. I mean, NYPA, as I understand it, is very much based on financing through the green bond market. And, there's a lot to be gained there, and the green bond market has exploded, over the last, 5 or 10 years, and it's hopefully going to continue to grow. Now, there's obviously limitations in terms of issuing bonds because it's ultimately, it ultimately faces market dependence. You, of course, need, the appropriate, ratings from companies like Stylistic and other bond rating agencies, but there's the market dependency. How do you sell those issues into the market, right? And what's the appropriate yield to attract investors? It's a good funding model, certainly, and it's valuable. But if you step back and look at the green bond market globally, you see that those issues that have been most successful have been those green bond issues that are linked to the state, right? Linked to the full faith and credibility of the state. The biggest issuer of green bonds today is Freddie and Fannie, right? And of course, they're funding all types of restructuring of the multi-residential market through their green bonds. Now, how green are these green bonds? Different story entirely. But these green bonds have been so successfully issued, and the market for green bonds, for Freddie and Fannie backed green bonds, has become so deep precisely because it's linked to the state, right? And so copying that platform would dramatically open up the amount of credit that institutions like yours and others, including green banks, would have access to. On top of that, it would alleviate to a certain extent the market discipline because these bonds will be backed by the full faith and credibility of the state. So we need to think big in that sense, right? If we want to generate the capacity on the scale necessary to address the problem, both locally and, of course, nationally, internationally.
And meanwhile, it's a public investment authority, and it would increase public ownership of all of these institutions and firms that would have to participate in the green transition. So not only would it support existing public institutions like NYPA, it would also increase public ownership because it could take equity positions in any private institutions that were necessary to participate in these projects, right? So if it's going to be directing some of this investment to private institutions, it would also hold equity, or could also hold equity in those private institutions. So you actually increase public ownership across the entire economy, right? And also public control over what these private firms do. So in terms of the relationship between public and private, this is a way of expanding public control and public ownership of the core parts of the economy that would have to be participating in a green transition, rather than just bribing corporations to do it themselves
Yeah.
for profits.
Well, thank you both so much for this really extremely exciting and ambitious model, which makes so much sense in relation to the kinds of on-the-ground debates that we've been having in public power. One of the big problems that has been happening, coming back to our initial discussion, is that the state has put forward all these auctions for companies to build, for instance, big offshore wind turbine developments. And then you get supply chain issues and inflation, meaning that the company's not going to be able to make enough profit, so they just walk away from the contracts that they've signed. And so one of our debates has been, well, can't NIPA step in and take over those projects, buy out those companies, something like that? But so far that hasn't happened, and it usually has to do with fears about the scale of the investment that would be necessary. I mean, it's pathetic, and it means that all of our political struggle can often feel really almost impossible to win. NIPA agreed to do a whole series of studies to decarbonize City University of New York and State University of New York institutions and some other dirty institutions across the state. But all they could do was fund the studies. They couldn't actually do the decarbonizing infrastructure, even on like one university campus. And we asked representatives when they came, well, can't you not just do the study, but actually, retrofit our campuses and put on solar panels? And they were like, well, that would cost billions of dollars, and we don't have the access to the capital. So this is such a huge issue. And no matter how much political leverage we build, they can always kind of, plead that there's not enough capital to actually do the projects. So getting around that issue, I think, is hugely important. Well, I'd like to ask you about, how we go forward with the kinds of ambitious plans that you all are proposing in the face of a Trump administration. It seems hard to imagine that anything positive will happen over the next 4 years, although obviously some kinds of projects along the lines that you're talking about may happen in other countries. But I do want to be cognizant of time and also give space to other folks who I'm sure are much more knowledgeable than me about financial issues and might want to ask the two of you questions. So we had Angela commenting in the chat earlier in our conversation about tax equity, about how oil sands funding happens in a similar kind of way through big tax breaks to corporations. But there haven't been any other questions so far in the chat, but I want to kind of open the floor to people who are attending, either to put questions in the chat for me to convey to Scott and Steve, or to raise your hand and bring up a question, or articulate a question yourself. We have about 20 minutes left in our conversation, just to let you know where we are in terms of time. So, any questions for Scott and Steve? Nothing immediately? Okay, well, while you think about it, then let me bring up that question of, what do we do, at least here in the US? And it looks like there's going to be a turn to the right in Canada as well. So, how do we fight in the current political conditions? And of course, the right is increasingly hegemonic globally. So what are the kind of political components, I guess I would ask, of winning the struggle for the kind of visionary funding structures and schemes that the two of you have been outlining?
Yeah. I mean, I know that the NIA idea, as it gets, as we describe it, it's incredibly wonky, right? And I think the illusion that some people fall into on the left is that there's like a technocratic fix, and that once you have the right institutional architecture outlined, then you have the problem figured out. In fact, that's not the case, right? This involves politics. And so what we're basically proposing when we talk about the NIA is we're thinking of a way for the left to organize around and think about how to concretely demand, what form a concrete demand for planning actually takes, right? Rather than say break up the banks doesn't help us. Break up the banks means restore competitiveness, some vision of restoring competitiveness in financial markets that will supposedly somehow be good for working people. But there's no reason to think that's the case. Break up the banks doesn't help us finance a green transition. Break up the banks doesn't help us improve workers' living standards. Break up the banks doesn't help us build a more democratic and just society, right? The left needs to be organizing around planning. And the NIA, the National Investment Authority that I was just outlining, is a way to think about concretely a way that the federal government could take an active role in investing, right? On behalf of the public, to increase public ownership and to increase public control over the economy. But the key point has to be that markets aren't going to work for us. Capitalism isn't going to work for us. Bribing for-profit corporations to participate in green energy transition is not going to work for us, right? We need a fundamentally different approach. And in order to get there, we have to organize, right? As you all know, there's no need for me to tell you all, after the kind of campaign, very impressive campaign you were involved in, that organizing working class people and educating working class people about these issues is where we have to start. It's pretty clear, yes, Trump is bad. I think it's clear that Trump is worse than Biden to me. I think I would rather have the $400 billion over 10 years in green energy investments that the IRA represented, as opposed to the zero that is likely to happen from the Trump administration, right? But that's nowhere near the scale of what's necessary to actually address the climate crisis, right? The International Energy Agency estimated we're going to need $4 trillion a year through 2030 to phase out fossil fuels. That's a far cry from the $400 billion over 10 years that the IRA allocated. Even if you add in the tax credits, I saw estimates that estimate that it's around 1.2 trillion. Still nowhere close, right? The odds that kind of a model is going to get us anywhere near where we have to be to actually undertake this transition is utopian, right? So the utopians are the liberals. The utopians are the Democrats. They're the ones who think that we can address climate change without challenging the existing structures of power and privilege, right? Socialists have to put forward the case very unambiguously and very clearly that the only way we deal with the climate crisis, the only way we deal with the ecological crisis is by fundamentally challenging capitalism. Not by bribing capitalism, not by increasing inequality by giving the biggest corporations tax breaks and undermining the capacity of the state to spend because you're eroding its tax base, right? But by fundamentally changing the way the economy works, that rather than being oriented around private profit, it's oriented around social and ecological need. And so the question then becomes, how do we make inroads towards that? I think that this National Investment Authority is one important way that we could think about doing that. And it's a much better program than break up the banks. Right? It means we control the economy. The public controls the economy. All of the frustrations, Ashley, that you were just describing basically come down to one fundamental problem. We don't control the economy, right? The reason why you keep running into those roadblocks is that the economy is not under public control. And so what you're fighting is a battle to expand public control over what happens with capital, over what happens with investment at the state level, right? And that has limits. So there needs to be a bigger project on a larger scale to increase public control over the economy, to make it so that we can invest in the kinds of things we want to do. And that will not happen to the Democratic Party, right? The Democratic Party was already in power for the past 4 years, and they gave us the IRA, which is nowhere near sufficient to deal with the problem. So what that tells us is that we need to organize the working class. We need to build the political capacities of the working class to participate democratically in politics, to act and to understand what's going on in the world around us, and to ultimately have a program, to be educated about the need for a program that we see as necessary as eco-socialists to actually address the crux of the issue. And that's not going to be easy, right? Because obviously just trying to talk about the NIA alone is incredibly difficult, right? It's a very complex thing, but more generally making the points about, the public controlling investment needing to be under the control of the public, the assets, the capacities needed to undertake a green transition needing to be under the control of the public, under democratic control. I think these are the kinds of programs that and visions that we have to be organizing around. And we're still pretty far from there, because I think in many circles, planning is still a dirty word, right? And it seems unrealistic. It seems like you're talking about the Soviet Union. And I think it's up to us, it's incumbent on us to explain how this is not going to fall into the same problems as the Soviet Union, how this is a fundamentally different conception of what that would mean, that is actually necessary to address the scale of the crisis. So to me, the political task is not just elect Democrats because Trump is bad. Yes, Trump is bad. Biden was already there, and Biden wasn't enough. We have to actually change the balance of power by organizing working class people. And they have to be educated about why ecological crisis is a serious issue for them and for their lives that they should care about. And that we have to be able to put forward a realistic program, not a utopian program, for addressing that. And I think that we're smart enough and we have some ideas kicking around where we can do that, but it's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah, I think it's worth remembering that the IRA, Biden's Green New Deal program, was actually a massive defeat for progressives. Bernie was proposing something on the order of $16 trillion that would have a whole series of federal energy authorities, sort of really amping up what we've fought for here around mobilizing NIPA. So yeah, there was a program on the table, and the Democratic Party essentially shut it down. So I totally agree with what you're saying, Steve, about how we need to make clear these plans for alternatives and use them to mobilize people. One of the other things that I really appreciate about the Public Power Campaign is that it's also emphasized the real benefits that would come from this kind of infrastructural production for members of the public, for working class people. It would mean massive numbers of well-paying jobs, right? And obviously one of the huge political crises we face today is the dearth of good-paying jobs. We have a question from someone on an iPhone. Are there other examples of publicly funded renewable energy buildouts aside from New York State? And how do those examples work? How are they advanced? And then also, Susan Spronk, you have your hand up. So why don't we let you ask your question, and then maybe Steve and Scott can field your question as well as the one from the person on the iPhone.
Hello, Susan. Nice to see you.
Hi, I thought I'd say something. I was waiting for the New Yorkers to go first, but lovely to see you. I'm also joining you from Ottawa, Canada. And I had the similar question to the person, but I had a second one, which is some thoughts about the framing. I absolutely agree with you. You're preaching to converted in my case, because I've been working on public banking and the role that it plays in transitions, including in the global south, which I think is a huge gap. And I've actually been looking for someone to interview on the international aspects of this policy, because the Canadian government, for example, just announced the last COP that they're giving about $1.5 billion in blended financing for climate initiatives. So it's upsetting to see more of the same. And the government is pretending it's new. It's just a pile of garbage. And I think you outlined really well why it is. So again, lots of work to do on the international scene there. But I wanted to ask, in addition to the question about examples, which you'll address through the chat question, I'm wondering, there was a wonderful left populist, Tommy Douglas of the old days, in the old NDP, when the NDP had socialism in its charter, who used to talk about the problem of corporate welfare. And I'm wondering if it's time to go back to some of those older terms, because when I hear you say bribing, Steve, I understand what you mean, but then it sounds like they're actually going to do it, which I think is not true. So I'm just wondering, about when we're using semantics are important in organizing, as we learn from people like Jane McAlevey. I'm just wondering your thoughts on a term like corporate welfare. Does that also describe maybe some of the problems with this approach of blended financing and de-risking?
I'll let you go, Scott, because I just ranted for about far too long.
Hi, Susan. Yeah, I mean, I think the corporate welfare term can be very useful indeed, insofar as what is happening here is, to subsidies to corporations to support projects that many of them aren't fulfilled. I do think, though, that the de-risking component really gets at a lot of what's happening as well. And that, of course, can be utilized in conjunction with the corporate welfare. But it is the socialization of risk, right, that is at the center of this. And if the subsidies are big enough, projects will be quote unquote profitable and projects will be fulfilled. And increasingly we're seeing, right, massive socializations of risk. And we're seeing the subsidies being large enough in many cases, not just in terms of green finance, but in terms of other state projects to facilitate capital investment. But it's hardly market oriented insofar as it is completely wrapped up with the full faith and credibility of the state. So yeah, I think the problem with de-risking obviously is that it's difficult to understand and it doesn't have the potency and power of the corporate welfare point. And I guess it's getting at the same logic overall. It is about ultimately, though, I think the point we want to get across is that the state is playing a critical role in socializing risk and at the same time allowing profitability to occur to corporations, despite the fact that the capitalist system, the capitalist market is not functional by itself in this sense, right? In the absence of state support. And so what we need to get at either way is the fact that capitalist markets don't work here. And if capitalist markets don't work, then we can either continue to subsidize corporations, bribe corporations, right? Provide welfare to corporations to make those markets work, or we can take the markets, right? And we can have direct allocation of investment. So, I mean, I think that's the point we ultimately have to get to. And whether it's corporate welfare or de-risking or bribery, I think they all kind of work. For us, we've tended to use de-risking because it gets at that critical component. But I'm not going to be the one that says Tommy Douglas's terminology here is wrong, to be sure.
Yeah, I think what Scott is getting at, which I completely agree with, is that whatever term one uses, one should not allow it to obfuscate the deeper point that needs to be made, that this is about the fundamental problems of capitalism and an economy oriented around profit. So I think there are ways in which sometimes social democratic critiques can be made, which hone in on particular corruption or particular aspects of monopoly and whatnot, which actually obfuscates the fact that the deeper issue here is fundamentally that an economy organized around profit-driven industrial investment won't be able to do it, right? Market competition disciplines us and constrains us from being able to resolve the problem. And that is empirically demonstrable in case after case, in dimension after dimension of any kind of green transition or just public infrastructure. I mean, to take a case that I've worked on a lot, Amazon, right? The way that tax credits are often handed to Amazon by states and municipalities, Amazon will say, okay, we're going to build these facilities. We're going to promise you that X jobs are going to be created once the facilities are built, right? First of all, as you pointed out, Susan, that oftentimes doesn't happen at all. The jobs that are promised don't materialize or don't materialize in the way that they were supposed to. But even aside from that, very often the tax credits that Amazon gets is sufficient to pay for all of that capital investment and the salaries of all the employees for the first term of employment. So what's Amazon doing? The public has just paid for 100% of the capital costs and the wage costs of those facilities, right? So from that perspective, corporate profit-driven investment is actually kind of old-fashioned, right? All it is a middleman between the public investment that's already being done and the actual work that needs to happen, and they're collecting profits out of that. So I think the point for me always has to come back to, unless you're getting at the fundamental problems of the reasons why capitalism is unable to cope with the green transition, the reason why capitalism and market competitiveness does not lend itself to the kind of national macro coordination and strategizing necessary to completely overhaul our entire economy, you're obfuscating the problem. So we have to continuously, I think, come back to that. And whatever term that ends up making sense, I think that the point for socialists should be to continuously draw the discussion back to that. Because anything short of that is just not going to do it. I mean, like Scott said, yeah, we could say bribing because, these capital investments are happening when they do the tax credits, right? They do invest very often in those projects. But does anybody really think that we're going to be able to get $4 trillion a year through 2030 through tax credits and market incentives? Of course not. There is absolutely no way that this project, that a scale on this scale can be carried out without an active, direct role of the state in investing. And so then we need to come up with a roadmap, a specific, realistic proposal, not just slogans, right? Not just saying, let's have revolution or bust, capitalism or barbarism. It's true, socialism or barbarism. It is true, but we have to put meat on the bones of that slogan by explaining exactly how we get from A to B. And it has to be a realistic roadmap that we could actually get people to fight for, that bring us from one point to the next. And that involves, just exactly as this campaign has been involved in, expanding public ownership, expanding public control, expanding economic and political democracy to wider and wider areas of our social life to meet our social needs and not to serve the private profits of corporations. That's a very long-winded answer to say I agree with you.
The points that you all have been making, I think, are also really hammered home. The points about how the capitalist system isn't going to get us where we need for green transition and for this essential infrastructure. These points are really hammered home if you just look at the history of the electric grid in the US. So in my research into that in the 1930s, there's a massive crisis about the corruption of energy utilities, including the ones that, as I alluded to at the outset, JP Morgan owned. But another element of the crisis was that these big corporations did not see it as in their financial interest to string lines, electric lines out to rural areas, right? Because consumers were really concentrated in cities. So that's where the grid was really actually built out in the US. And there was no financial incentive to lay all that infrastructure out and support rural electrification. So during the New Deal, FDR created this Rural Electrification Association that gave low interest loans to cooperatives in rural areas in order to help facilitate that. And it's very interesting to look at the kind of public rhetoric that circulated at the time. I found some really fascinating newspaper articles by advisors to FDR who talked about the fear that the American system of free market capitalism wasn't going to be able to compete with centralized states, whether it was the Soviet Union or fascist states like Mussolini's Italy, because it just didn't have the capacity to do this kind of national economic and infrastructural planning, right? So it's really interesting to sort of turn the clock back 100 years and look at how the conversations we're having today were actually quite similar, and a solution was found then that involved the kinds of national planning, economic and political. So
yeah,
we're almost at the end of our time. I wanted to let folks know, if you didn't see, that I put a link to the Omarova and an article by Omarova about a national investment authority along the lines of what Steve and Scott have been describing. I want to thank the two of you for joining us to discuss your work and your ideas about green transition, and thank everyone who tuned in and asked questions. Before we go, though, I'll just turn things over to you, Scott and Steve, for any final words that you might have.
Yeah, I mean, one final thing I might say is that this gets back to the project and green bonds. I think the left has to understand credit and has to think about the capacity of the state and the capacity for change in terms of the credit system. It's clear that simply funding a green transition on the tax base, right, even if the tax base was more equitable, is not feasible, right? So you have to tap into credit markets, the capacity of the existing financial system to generate and create credit, whether through the banking system, through the bond market, et cetera. That has to be a part of what's happening. So if we're going to tap into credit markets and use credit markets in a way that allows us to build the capacity to get out of capitalism, right? What does that look like, right? And how do we have to use state power, and how do we have to use the state and incorporate the state and transform the state in a way to do that, right? And we have to think seriously about that and think hard about that. And we have to be able to link up local projects, municipal projects, state projects, provincial projects, etc., with a national credit creating system. And that takes us to the central bank, that takes us to Treasury, the Treasury Department or the Finance Department in Canada, etc. And this is why the Omarova's plan is exciting and is interesting. Because it gets us out of questions about fiscal capacity, the capacity of the state to fund this off the tax base. And it draws in local and regional projects into national projects and gets the left thinking about credit, how credit's created, and how credit and control over investment, right, can be harnessed for, green developmental projects, for social justice projects, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we really have to continue to push in this direction and have these wonky conversations and continue to have dialogue on these issues and think about what has to be done and what can be done in a way that, that draws attention to the scope of the problem, but the capacities necessary within the state that have to be developed to solve the problem, at least, or to push towards a solution of some sort.
Maybe I'll just put a period on that by saying what I think amounts to the same thing, which is that the state that we now have evolved historically to reproduce capitalism. That's why it exists. And part of that has involved extending greater and greater public support to the private financial system, such that right now, as we outline in our book, the capitalist financial system is fully underpinned and supported by the state. It's fully integrated with the state. It's fully supported by the state. So we have a publicly supported financial infrastructure that is controlled by private individuals, right? So who decides where that capital is allocated? Private individuals interested in their own profit. Who supports that system? The state, the public, right? The public has extended unlimited support to that financial system, which is controlled and directed by private individuals. We should reverse this equation, right? We should be moving toward a situation in which the publicly supported financial system is controlled by the public to a larger and larger extent over time. And what that means then is transforming the state fundamentally. So that rather than a state that is organized around protecting the private power of capitalists to control our economy, we have a state that is the centerpiece of a democratically controlled economy, in which the public, in a democratic fashion, has the capacity to direct investment into projects and activities that are socially necessary, whether or not they're private, whether or not they're profitable. And that means getting out of the logic of market discipline and competitiveness, right? Competitiveness is a barrier to getting where we want to go, not a vehicle for progressive politics.
Well, thank you so much, Steve and Scott. I think you've provided us with some incredibly lucid mental maps of the unjust current system where, we, the public, finance the fat cats to drive our economy and our society into the ground environmentally, and a kind of model of an alternative that we could fight for, whereby we would control and fund public infrastructure that we so desperately need. So thanks so much for your work and for joining us today. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in. And we'll be placing a copy of today's conversation online at the Public Power Observatory. So please let your friends know about it and share it widely. All right. Goodbye, everyone. And see you.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Struggle.